Okay, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining me again. Um, we're on the final Amud of Masechet Sukkah. We may be able to be Messiah it today, or reach within a line or two of the end of this Gemara. And please God, next time we will start, if we haven't finished this, we will do the final bit. But otherwise, we will start on Masechet Yuma. We will start on the first Perek. I think we'll start in Yuma, but we probably won't go through every single page in order. There's a lot of korbanot in Masechet Yuma, which will perhaps be a little bit difficult for people to digest on an ongoing basis. So we'll be a little bit picky. But we have gone through almost every daf of Sukkah, so that's really been quite an experience. And maybe we'll hold some sort of symbolic party to celebrate the completion of this Masechta at some time. No great rush for that at all. Let me just remind you what we were doing last week. The Gemara is essentially commenting on the Mishnah that we learnt, and the Mishnah had spent quite a long time discussing the lechem haponim, the showbread. And you remember, the lechem haponim was the bread placed on the shulchan. I showed you these beautiful, large, as it happened to be, chometz loaves, huge loaves that were placed on the shulchan, the particular table inside the sanctuary of the Beis Hamikdash. And the ritual with the lechem haponim was that it was delivered each week fresh on Shabbat. That means a fresh set of 12 large loaves were placed on the table, and the old loaves were removed. And that represented the point at which the two mishmarot would meet. The Mishmar Hayotze, the Mishmar, the group of Kohanim that had its rota for the previous week, would take out the old breads, and then the new Mishmar coming in for the next week would then join. The relay handover was then there and then on the Shabbat, and they'd bring in the new loaves, and those new loaves would stay on for another week. And the old loaves, the loaves that had been removed, would be eaten by the Kohanim. And the Mishnah said that essentially 6 loaves of the 12 were given to each of these two groups, 6 to the incoming group, and who would also have something to eat, even though it was from the old loaves. And the outgoing group would also eat their 6 loaves. The loaves remained fresh, according to the Chazal, as one of the miracles in the Beis Hamikdash. They didn't go off during the 7 days that they were sitting on the table in the Heichal. So that division took place, and the Mishnah then went on to say that the division took place with the eating of the loaves. The incoming group ate in the north side of the Beis Hamikdash, of the Chotzer, and the outgoing group on the south side. So remember, I shared screen. Just share again. Just go through this. Well, actually, it was the very first one that would have been a good diagram here. So we have a chotzer here, this whole area that surrounds the heichal in the middle is the chotzer where the sacrificial activities take place. Here's the mizbeach. And the north side, that's Sophon, is here. So that's where the incoming group would eat their 6 loaves, and the outgoing group would eat their 6 loaves over here. And the rationale for that was that we were giving special covet to the incoming group, and we'll see that later on actually, because they were the ones who were about to undertake their avodah, and the north side had a higher level of status of kedusha than the south side, because Kodesh Kadoshim, the very holiest korbanos, were shechted here rather than here on the south. So this area here, this north side area over here, had a greater status. So the incoming Mishmar had the privilege of eating their loaves over here. If you like, their sandwich time was in the more holy part of the Beis Hamikdash. The Mishnah went on to say that there was a group, and this is something we'll study a little bit more later on, called Bilga, one of the groups of Kohanim, one of the Mishmarot. And if you remember, when I showed you all these 24 Mishmarot, the 24 groups of Kohanim, each who had a rota for a week, and then the rotas would start again for another 24 weeks. And they had calendar dated rotas. They knew when their rota was going to be. It's a bit like timeshare, sort of time sharing an asset. They time shared their service in the Beis Hamikdash. And here we have Bilgah. Bilgah is number 15. So this lot over here were penalized. And they were penalized in several ways, the Mishnah said. They were penalized in that they always ate their lechem haponim in the south, in the less holy place, whether they were incoming or outgoing. Even if they were incoming, they ate in the south rather than the north, which was essentially to humiliate them somewhat. And also, we said that their rings were shackled. Remember these rings where you place the heads of the animal? These are rotating rings, and in position like this, the animal's head would be trapped, and then the shrita or whatever could be done. That was the normal thing. Here's the ring in an open position before you actually rotate it so it locks into place. The Mishnah said Bilgah were penalized in that their ring was cemented into this position, which means that they couldn't use it. Their ring was deliberately put out of action so that they would always have to borrow a ring for their sacrificial involvements from some other group, which was an additional level of humiliation because everyone had their own. There were 24 rings, and indeed you could really see the 24 very, very much in outline here. These dots here are the 24 6x4 array of rings. So one of those rings which belonged to Bilgah, which had, if you like, the Bilgah's name on it, was always cemented into place. And also the Mishnah said that the area in the Beis Hamikdash where they kept their shrita knives, at least according to one opinion, which was over here, their locker, which they would access through the side, was also cemented shut, so they couldn't get into it. So they had to borrow the tools, so to speak, from other Kohanim. So although they continued their service, Bilgah, they were penalized in that they rather were given a lower status than all the other 23 mishmaros, and it was very visual and apparent to all the other groups. And this was a form of punishment. What was it a punishment for? Well, that's what we're going to see. That's going to be the mainstay of today's shir. Okay, so let me just quit sharing for a moment. So we'll take up the Gemara again on 56b, which is the last Talmud, and we're going to take it up from the third line. The line begins, Omar Abaye, Budzina Tava Mikora, and you can imagine there's a full stop there, even though there isn't. We're going to start from the penultimate two words, Omar Rav, and then Yehuda, Omar Rav Yehuda. Rav Yehuda says the following: having talked about the division of the Lechem Haponim, how they were divided between the outgoing Mishmar Kahuna and the incoming Kahuna in terms of the showbreads, that 6 were given to one and 6 and to the other, the Gemara provides here a statement about another form of division of the spoils, if you like, of the Kohanim. And this was on the Musaf Karbonot. Uva Musafin, Rav Yehuda, he said the following: Uva Musafin, when it came to the Musaf Karbonot, which are the special Karbonot for Shabbat, Rosh Chodesh, etc., Cholkin, these were also divided between the outgoing and incoming group. Now that is absolutely incorrect if we take this literally, because the Musaf Karbonot were olot, they were burnt offerings. There was no area, no aspect of that carbon was made available to the Karbonot to take home or to eat in the Beis Hamikdash. It was fully burnt up on the Mizbeach. And Olah is burnt up complete on Mizbeach. There's nothing to eat from the Kohanim. It's not like many other Karbonos where the Kohanim get an area, a section of it. They're given no share at all into the Olah. So what does it mean here when it says that we divide up between the two groups, the Musafim? It cannot be the bossar, cannot mean the meat. So therefore, Rashi explains here that we're talking about the oros, the skins. The skins. Now, even an olah, obviously, before it was burnt up, we're talking about large animals, so their skins, they would flay the skin, and the skins were valuable. The skins were used for all sorts of warmth and for containers or whatever it happened to be. They were a valuable asset. And the Kohanim were allowed to divide up the skins from the animal, not the meat that's put onto the Mizbeach. This is what we're talking about over here, that the skins of the Musaf offering, even though the flesh itself is burnt up, the skins, once removed, would be divided between the Mishmar Hayotze and the Mishmar Hanichnas. They would all have a bit of it, if you like. That's what Rav Yehuda said. So basically, the Gemara now brings a kasha against Rav Yehuda, who says that they were divided up. And it brings this from a brisa, which is an authoritative Mishnaic contemporary statement of halacha. Mishmeres Hayotzes, Mishmora Hayotzes, the group of Kohanim who are leaving, in other words, they're the ones who are going home. They've done their 7-day duty. Osa, and here we're told what the two groups actually do on the day of Shabbat when there is this handover. Who does what? This is what this brisa deals with. Mishmora Hayotzes, the outgoing group who are going to leave during the course of the Shabbat. Osa, what do they do during the day while they're still there? Osa Tomid Shel Shacha. They are the ones who prepare the korban tomid of the morning, which is early in the morning. Umusafin. And they also prepare the musaf korban. That is, they would take the skin off and then they would put the meat up on the mizbeach and it would all be burnt up. That was their job. The incoming group, the ones that are going to spend the next 7 days in the Beis Hamikdash, who've just taken hold of their new rota, Osa, their responsibility on that day of Shabbat would be to do the Tomid Shel Ben Harbaim, the second Tomid of the day, the afternoon Tomid. If like there's a morning, it's devoted to the whole morning up to midday almost, is devoted to the service of the outgoing group, and the afternoon services are provided by the new incoming group. So they would do the Tomid Shel Ben Harbaim, Ubozichin, and they'd also do a ceremony called a bozichin, and just it's not terribly important, just by and by, let me just share screen here. What are bozichin? Bozichin are the kapot levona. We'll see what they are in a moment. This is not a very good picture. I apologize for this. I couldn't find a good picture anywhere of bozichin. If you can see, here's the shulchan again, although it looks a little bit different. That's a side view. You have here 2 columns of loaves. These are large, strangely shaped loaves. 6 on one side of the table, 6 on the other side of the table. And what this diagram shows you in addition, which is something we never discussed, and there's an arrow over here, right in the middle. However much I magnify it, you're not going to see it clearly because it just becomes more blurry. But there are 2 tiny little containers. Actually, they're called kapot, which means ladles. The way they're shown over here, they're not ladles. They're little gold jars. Anyway, what they contain is levona. They contain frankincense, some form of incense. And they remain on the table between the 2 columns of loaves. On the Shabbat, when the 12 loaves are removed, the old lot, and the new 12 loaves are put in, at the same time, the outgoing group also pick up the containers of bezichin, and they take them outside to the mizbeach over here, and they offer them up with fire. They're just to make a nice incense smell. They're no more than a besomim type fragrance when they're burning. So that was the little ceremony of a bezichin. It was using the incense that had been placed, the powder incense that had been placed into these 2 little jars, if you don't mind. So here we say that this actually belongs to the incoming. Actually, they're the ones who actually take these 2 bezichin, not the outgoing lot, but the incoming ones. They take them outside through the heichal, outside to the mizbeach, and then they burn them up on mizbeach, and that is their function. So that's the bezichin. So that is another function done by the incoming group. So the Gemara says, well, so what? So the Gemara says, how? What's missing from here is ve'ilu musafin cholkin lo katani. This is going to be dismissed as a question very quickly because it's a very bad question. This brisa that tells you what the incoming group do and what the outcoming group do on a Shabbat, how they divide up the functions for the day, does not mention anything about them dividing up the skins. So if it mentions nothing here in this detailed brisa about dividing up the skins, then presumably they didn't divide up the skins. It was the people who did the skins, that is the outgoing group who did the musaf. They probably get it all. They deserve it all because they did all the work. The incoming group had presumably nothing to do with preparing the musaf. We said in the brisa the musafin were done by the outgoing group, and it doesn't say that there was any division with the incoming group. So from what it doesn't say, we assume that the two groups did not share, but only the outgoing group who did the musaf ceremony, they're the ones entitled to the skins of the musaf animals. So that's the kasha over here. The musafin cholkin okotani, the brisa over here, which had an opportunity to do so, mentioned nothing about the division of the skins of the musaf. So the Gemara answers, and the answer is a very obvious answer, really, if you looked at the context of the brisa I just mentioned before, is Hai Tana, the brisa that we've just quoted, which talked about the division of functions for the Shabbat between the incoming and the outgoing group. Bachaluka lo kamairi. That has nothing to do with what that was divided up as gifts for the two sets of Kohanim. We're not talking here about what they can eat and what they can take home. Our brisa was merely telling you which Kohanim did what job, not what privileges they were entitled to. Don't look at what's missing in the brisa and say, that means there's no division. We're not talking about dividing anything in terms of the gifts to the Kohanim, what they're entitled to eat, for example. We're not talking about that. We're talking only about jobs. The job division was given. However, the Gemara will insist at this point that the actual skins may well be divided between the two groups. At this point, the Gemara brings another kasha, which is going to be irrefutable, to prove that there was no division of the skins. So, Omerova, v'hotana debei Shmuel, you can't argue that way that there was division of the animals, of the animal skins, because v'hotana debei Shmuel, because we have another brisa of the Beis HaMedrash of Shmuel, Demairi Bachaluka, which does refer to the division of gifts between the Kohanim. And it also doesn't mention the division of skins, even where it should have, because in this next brisa, we're going to be talking about not just the functions, but also what they were allowed to take for themselves. And the taking of skins between the two groups isn't mentioned. So let's see the brisa. We've just introduced it. The Tana Beis Shmuel, because the school of Shmuel, Beis HaMedrash of Shmuel, taught the following. Again, you recognize some of the language, but there's some extras here. Mishmara hayotzes, the outgoing group of Kohanim, Osa Tomid shel Shacha umusofin, which is something we saw before. They do the Tomid, the korban Tomid of the morning, and the Musaf korban. They prepare that as well on the Shabbos. Umishmara hanichneses, and the incoming group, Osa Tomid shel ben harbayin ubazichin. They do the afternoon Tomid and bezichin. So far, exactly the same as the statement of Rav Yehuda, but it goes on further, and it's this next piece which is going to provide irrefutable evidence that the skins are not divided between all the groups. So the brisa goes on to say, "Va'arba kohanim hayu nichnasim misham, shnayim mimishmazu, ushnayim mimishmazu." Says that in terms of dividing things up, 4 kohanim would get together, 2 from the incoming group and 2 from the outcoming group. These were just going to be the administrators, if you like, on behalf of each group, because the Kohanim groups may have been scores of Kohanim each. So these are 2 representatives of each of those 2 groups, the incoming and the outgoing. And it goes on to say in the brisa, v'cholken lechem haponim, and the 2 groups, therefore, incoming and outgoing, would then divide the lechem haponim. Ve'ilu ba'oris hamusafin hamusafin cholkin lo katani. It doesn't mention anything about dividing up the skins. This latter statement gave us the only thing that the brisa says was divided between the incoming, the outgoing group. Only the lechem haponim, as we said before. Whereas before, Rav Yehuda wanted to say that not just the lechem haponim was divided between the two groups, but also the skins of the musaf. Well, here we have a brisa that deals with a division of the lechem haponim, and it's a general brisa that talks about the musaf and everything else, but it does not mention the division of the skins. And that's a sore thumb over here. If you really say that just like the lechem haponim was divided between the two groups, so was also the skins of the musaf. It should have mentioned it over here, but it doesn't. So the Gemara says from this, Tiyufta de Rav Yehuda, Tiyufta. This is an upfragung. This is a complete refutation of Rav Yehuda, who says that the skins were divided, because by the lack of mention over here, we can assume that the skins were not divided, only the lechem haponim. The skins belong to the group that performed the ritual of the musaf, which we said was the outgoing group. So they would have had the skins themselves. It wouldn't be divided also amongst the incoming group. So the Gemara has finished this little session and has determined there was no division of the skins of the Korban Musaf. Only the lechem haponim is divided. The shewbread was very much the exception in terms of the incoming group at the time of changeover and the outgoing group. It was only the lechem haponim that was divided. Okay, we're going to move more into the main topic now. So the Gemara carries on. Hanichnosin cholkin batsofa, and this is another quote from the Mishnah. We said those who come in, when they receive their share of lechem haponim at the division, they eat it at the north, because we said it was the holier side. So Toner Rabbanon, and here we're quoting the brisa that actually gives us this information. Hanichnosin cholkin batsofon, the group coming in, they have their division of bread in the north, in order that it becomes obvious that they are the group that are coming in for their rota. We'll explain this in a moment. Hayotzin cholkin badorom, those who are about to leave, they have and they eat their divided elements, the divided portions of the lechem haponim in the south. In order that it could be seen visually, if you like, and observationally, that this group is the group that is going home, so to speak, that is leaving. Somehow we want to make it apparent which is the incoming group, which is the outgoing group. We're not just allowing them all to mix in some sort of total social party. So we give them fixed seating, if you like, and we advertise those who have come in by allowing them to be in the more privileged part of the Azara, and those who are leaving, in a sense, it sounds like downplaying them a bit, and this is a bit problematic. We put in the lower element, in the more plebeian, if you like, the stalls, right, of the Azara, and it's clear, therefore, that they are not going to spend the next 7 days in the Beis Hamikdash. They're about to go home. So the Gemara, again, the Gemara doesn't explain why we should give more of a privilege. After this lot have just spent 7 days, the group that are going, maybe they should be given the privilege. They just spend 7 days in the Beis Hamikdash. Why don't you give them a going home party? They're the ones maybe who should be in the privileged north. Why do we send them to the underprivileged south? So it seems, I mean, the Gemara doesn't discuss this over here. If one speculates, the reason for it could well be that when a person comes in to do a mitzvah, we try to offer them real encouragement. When they've done the mitzvah already, well, HaKadosh Baruch Hu will give them the reward for their mitzvah. The outgoing group have done their avoda for the week. HaKadosh Baruch Hu will give them their reward for that. But the people who've just come in and made a trek from wherever they've made from Haifa to get to the Beis Hamikdash, because it's their group today and their group lives in Haifa, and they just come in and they're just about to do a mitzvah, you want to encourage them at the time at which the mitzvah starts. And you do that by giving them the more privileged pride of place here. You put them in the north. We do find some similar ideas over here about how you try to encourage people to come at the beginning of when they first arrive. You give them a round of applause, not so much when they leave. You give them a round of applause when they arrive. A very good example of this, actually it's perhaps two examples. One is Bikurim. The Mishnah in Bikurim says that when the Bnei Yisrael, the farmers, used to come up with their wagons of fruits, whatever, to bring their first fruits to Yerushalayim, which they had to do, which was a long slog through the whole of Eretz Yisrael, that in every village people would come out and they would decorate them and they would sing and they would dance and they would accompany them and saying, you know, keep going, keep going. You encourage a person who's coming to do the mitzvah. There's another idea also in Maseches Rosh Hashanah which talks about the Eidim, those people who come up because they want to give testimony that they've just seen the slightest glint of a new moon. And they need to come up to the Yerushalayim to tell the Sanhedrin there so that they can be interviewed, and then the Rosh Chodesh will be fixed according to the observations. Before we had a fixed calendar, then when people came up to the Beis HaMikdash, they were given fine room, they were given excellent clothes, they were given wine and meals, even if they weren't needed, even if they were not the first people to come. They could have been number 16 who came along to say they'd seen the moon. Another 15 people had come an hour before them. Nevertheless, to encourage people to come, you offer them, it's a carrot, to say, you know, okay, maybe we won't need you today, but it's a great thing you came. We might need you in 6 months, you may see, and you may be the first witness to come, and we will fix a new moon based upon your testimony. So this encouragement. And over here, the new group that are coming in, the Nichnosim, are given this encouragement by being placed in the more privileged part of the Azorah. Okay, now let's go on to the more exciting piece, which deals with this strange episode we found at the end of the Mishnah, which dealt with the group Bilgah. So let me just share screen with you again. If you remember, where am I? Here we are. It's a bit too big, isn't it? So out of these 24 Mishmaros I showed you, the name of the Mishmar, the family, the arch umbrella family name is this first column, Yehoyariv, Yedaya. Number 15 is Bilgah. So Bilgah is a real name, and this name appears in Divrei Hayomim. This is from the Bible. So this group were already a group established under the family name of Bilgah, and this carried on for a very, very long time, even into Bais Sheni. Because the story of Bilgah we're about to read now, according to Rashi at least, concerns the family at the time of Bais Sheni, when they were a regular Mishmar coming into the Beis HaMikdash. And they were punished, the Mishnah said. So why were they punished? So the Mishnah said, Bilgah la'olam cholekes badorom, that Bilgah were always asked to divide their showbread with the outgoing group. They were always told to do so in the south, even when they were incoming. When they should have been given the privilege of the north, they were relegated to the south, which means presumably that the group that served with them, the group that were going, were allowed to be in the north. There would have been a swap. We'll see that later on. Every time Bilgah was one of a partnership of two, and it was the outgoing, it was forced to be in the south because outgoing groups are always in the south. If it was incoming, it was forced to be in the south because it was penalized. So it was never allowed to eat its chelek in the north. So the Gemara wants to know what it is that so incensed Chazal, or whoever they were, the management of the Beis HaMikdash, that they were to exclude this group of Bilgah from its normal privileges. So here the Gemara brings you the awesome story of Miriam bas Bilgah. Anyway, Tana Rabbanan, the Brisa taught the following story. Masa Miriam bas Bilgah. Miriam was the name of a woman. She was the daughter of Bilgah. We have to be a bit careful when we say she was the daughter of Bilgah, because Bilgah probably first existed like 500 years earlier on. You know, we're talking about Divrei Hayomim or whatever. However, Miriam was the daughter of one of the heads of the clan of Bilgah, as it was at that time. And this was during the Hasmonean period, when the Hasmonean kings were around. And what did she do? Shehemira Data. She apostatized herself, would be the best way to translate this. Not only did she apostatize, she did something much worse still. She went and married the captain of the Greek guard. So here we have the Greeks are opposed to the Bnei Yisrael anyway. So she decides to become a non-Jewess and adopt, it seems, Greek gods, and then she marries into the enemy. It's not as if that she's adopted their religion, but she's married into the enemy. What a terrible case. So far, so good. What has this got to do with the whole group? Well, let's go on with the story. And who was this Sardiot? Who was this captain? Echad mi malchei Yavonim. That's what how the Bryce describes him. One of the doesn't mean one of the kings. It means one of the noble leaders, or maybe military guards of the Yavonim. And what happened? It gets worse and worse. At the time of Matisyahu, when the Yavonim entered the Heichal, this is before they were, if you like, repelled completely by the Hashmonaim after battles. When they entered into the Heichal and they wanted to set up whatever it was, their idols there, or whatever it is they want to set up, they entered by force into the Heichal. She accompanied the Greek captain she was married to. She took off her sandal, her shoe, and she slapped it on the top of the altar of the Mizbeach. And what did she say? V'amra, and she said the following. She proclaimed the following loudly to everyone. Lucas, Lucas. Lucas means wolf. It's from the Greek. Wolf, wolf. Ad mosai atom vale mamonon shel Yisrael. How long are you going to consume the money of the Jewish people? V'yi ata omed alehem b'shas hatchak. Yet you do not stand up for them at their time of need. What is she saying over here? Why is she calling the Mizbeach Lucas, Lucas, wolf, wolf? So the Maharshal says that she knew the Mizbeach was for burning up korbanos. So she says, what use is this Mizbeach? It's like a wolf. A wolf ravages its prey and consumes its animal and eats it. The Mizbeach is the same. It's just like a wolf. This Mizbeach is just a stone wolf that consumes the korbanos that are placed on it, taking up the money of the Jewish people who buy their korbanos. And what's more, if at least this Mizbeach would protect the Jewish people from its enemies, then I would understand. But here I am, married to a Greek captain. We're plundering the Beis HaMikdash, and the Jewish people around us are helpless. So what good is this Mizbeach? It consumes the money of the Jewish people. It's like a ravenous wolf in eating up the korbanos, but it does not give anything in return. It hasn't provided any salvation to the Jewish people. A horrific statement. By the way, Lucas, yeah, in medicine today, there's this weird case of a person who thinks he's a werewolf. Yeah, it's called lycanthropy. Yeah, it's every so many years there's someone who's locked up in asylum thinking that he's a wolf and believing that he's growing fur and his eyes are becoming tilted and all sorts of things like that. It's a recognized syndrome. And it needs a very severe treatment. So lycanthropy is from Lucas, lycos, and anthrope. So it's a man, a person who thinks that he's taken up the form of a wolf. So this is a Lucas over that's coming into the story over here. So what happened? So the Gemara carries on. This Brisa carries on. When this became known to the sages, so they say over here, this means after the Hashmonaim had overthrown the Yavonim. And they realized that this daughter of Bilgah had said these dreadful things and married her, and she was apostatized and married the captain of the Greek guard. What did they do? They kov'u es tabata v'sosmu es chalona. They locked up the ring that we saw before, the rotating ring, so that the group of Bilgah from whom she descended would not have the privilege of its own ring, and closed up the window or the cubby hole in which the shechita knives were kept, and also that she had to divide. They had to divide their lechem aponim in the south rather than the north. Now the Gemara is going to ask the obvious question in a few minutes: why blame the whole of Bilgah, which could have been dozens or hundreds of Kohanim, for the sins of Miriam Bas Bilga. So she went off the derech. You know, why blame everyone for it? The Gemara is going to ask that question in a moment. But let's just go on. So that's the story, according to version 1, why Bilga were punished. Because of Miriam Bas Bilga's apostatization and her dreadful behavior in the Beis HaMikdash. But there's a Yesh Omrim. Yesh Omrim, there's another view of the background behind the penalized, the penalties imposed on the group of Bilga. Mishmato Shoalovo. The reason was, you know what? The group of Bilga, this makes a lot more sense, by the way, and it's much less complicated. The group of Bilga that had their rota, right? Today was the 15th of Tishri. For the next 7 days, they're supposed to come into the Beis HaMikdash. Very few of them turned up. You know why? Maybe there was a good football match, Haifa versus Tel Aviv somewhere. Maybe they were too involved in high tech in the business park. Who knows? But most of those Kohanim who should have been turning up to the Beis HaMikdash just didn't turn up. They had a pillow day. They remained at home. So as a result of this, the Nichnas Yeshevav Achiv Imo and the outgoing group, which was Yeshevov, they were there, the Shimesh Tachtov, and they did the full sets of duties on that Shabbat rather than with Bilga. And again, I'll show you what this means. Let's share the screen. Where am I? This is the one. Look at this. Just before Bilga, it all makes sense, doesn't it? Number 14, where it's actually says a Yeshavov. That was the Mishmar who were just precede that of Bilga. Now, what that means is that if we were reaching the week when Bilga number 15 comes in, the outgoing group would be the one before, which is Yeshavav. So you had Yeshavav. They were hoping to go home, yes? And they didn't want to do the afternoon Talmud, etc., etc. But Bilga didn't show up, the group coming in. So they had to stay behind, and therefore they did the job. And because Bilga didn't turn up to do their slot and they left it all to Yeshavov, they lost some of their privileges. They were not outcast, but they lost their privileges in the Beis HaMikdash. And that's the story according to the second version. And the Brisa goes on to say, we're carrying on, Afal pi shechreinei harisham losh nistakru. Even though normally we have this room, we'll see this later on. You remember this is from, I think, isn't it Pirkei Avos? Oyle Rosha, Oyle Shcheno. Woe is to an evil man, woe is to his neighbor. You know, the Gemara learns that from various instances, that if you've got a choice, you should live next to good people, because if you live next to bad people, even though you might try to go your own way, it isn't going to work. Something will rub off on you, and it's better for you to separate, which means not to be party or partners to a bad group of people. Now, that's a general principle. Even though they said it, Shreinei Bilga Nistakru. It turns out that Bilga's neighbors actually gained. Shebilga le'olam cholemes badorom, v'yeshevav ochiv batzofon. Because from that time onwards, who was the neighbor of Bilga? Well, in a sense, we're talking about a neighbor. We're not talking about where they live next to each other. But the outgoing group they should have shared the Shabbat with was this Yeshavev group. So they were like neighbors. They're neighbors on the rota. They were number 14, Bilga was number 15. They were neighbors on the rota. Now, normally, we just said there's a principle that a neighbor, usually there's some sort of damage, collateral damage to the neighbor if he's a neighbor of a bad person. Over here, Yeshavev gets collateral benefit, because it turns out that whenever Yeshavev are in the Beis HaMikdash, since they always share up, they're always consecutive, if you like, with Bilga, they're always going to divide up their bread in the south, in the north, which is a privileged place, because their party partners coming in, Bilga, is always condemned to be in the south, which means Yeshavev, even though they should be in the south, are always going to be in the north. So the Mishnah here is being a little bit facetious here and saying, here we have an example where the neighbor of a bad person is actually gained from being next to a bad person because it's getting pride of place every week. Whether it's incoming or outgoing, it's always going to be eating in the south, in the privileged south. Okay. So the Gemara goes on to say, Bishlamod lamand omar mishmarto shohalavo. The Gemara says, now the Gemara is going to moralize on these two different explanations given for Bilgah's punishment. The first one, that Miriam Bas Bilgah essentially disgraced the whole tribe and the whole mishmar of Bilgah. And the other explanation, simply that they were late. You know, they didn't turn up. They were lazy. As a group, they were lazy. So the Gemara says, look, I understand the second answer much more logically than the first. Let's see what the Gemara says. It makes sense according to the view that the reason they were punished is because their mishmar, Bilgah's mishmar, was late or didn't bother turning up. That makes sense. That's why we might decide to penalize the whole group of mishmar, because the whole group of mishmar essentially should be condemned for it seems they were a completely bad apple all the way through. Very few, it says a very few turned up. The majority didn't turn up. So since it was a group sin, then we might as well punish the group as a whole. So that I understand why we punish the whole group of Bilgah, that they always divide in the north and that their cubby hole is locked up, etc., etc. Elalamand Omar. But according to the version, Miriam Bas Bilgah Shehemira Dut, it's all because of a single woman, Miriam Bas Bilgah, who apostatized herself. So the Gemara says, that makes sense. Mishum brate konsin and leila day. Why should we punish even her father, so to speak? Because of the daughter. We don't punish generations. You know, we don't go up a generation, punish the parent necessarily, or punish the child of a person who has behaved reprehensibly. We say every person gets punished for his own sins. It's a principle. So what's going on over here? Why is this collateral degradation that we're imposing here on the rest of Bilgah, simply because this one woman went off the derech? So that's the Gemara's question. So now the Gemara is going to answer in two parts. Amar Abaye Abaye says, you know what? You're on in saying, you're wrong if you say it's unjustifiable to blame the parents for their children. It is justifiable. Now listen to the way the Gemara uses a well-known phrase or saying, which we don't know very well, but obviously would have been a catchphrase at the time with the Gemara. So Amar Abaye, quite correct. Even if you say it was all Miriam Bas Bilgah, it was right to punish Bilgah, the father, if you like, as well, because as people say this all the time. Shuta dianuka bishuka, o davuha odime, which means when you hear the conversation of a little child in the street or in the marketplace, you know that must have heard something like it from their parents. In other words, children don't have independent thoughts so much. They picked it up. They by osmosis or whatever it is. And a little child, therefore, if it says something strange, probably he heard it at home. He doesn't know to say that he heard it at home, and he doesn't know in order to preserve a secret. So he's actually essentially spewing out what he's heard elsewhere. We're saying Miriam Bas Bilgah, they say this as well, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. You may not like this expression very much, but if Miriam behaved this way, the Gemara wants to say that it proves there was something in her upbringing, her parents' upbringing, which has made this happen. Now, this is very, very, very problematic, because we know this is not always the case. But the Gemara is saying that over here, and maybe the Gemara says this over here, not because it's a general rule about the whole of mankind, but we're talking here about a Mishmar Kohanim. And the Mishmar Kohanim should have had a certain isolationist aspect to them, because Kohanim couldn't become Tomei, they had to eat Truma, all sorts of things would separate Kohanim from the rest of society. So they should have been in the best position to bring up their children in a way in which they wouldn't leave the fold. And over here, we have the most disgraceful case possible. It's not just a case of Miriam deciding to leave the family home and becoming a Frenchman. We're talking about her apostatizing, marrying a Greek captain, and walking smartly into the Beis HaMikdash and slapping the Mizbeach on it. And somehow the Gemara doesn't think that means that she's stark raving mad. But we believe that she is, and she was in full possession of her faculties, but she had somehow been in an environment which made this possible. Not necessarily her parents were apostatizers, but her parents somehow were cynics or skeptics, and that led to the slippery slope which produced the end result of being Heimirot Dato. Okay, so that you can argue ad infinitum as to whether it's right or wrong, but the Gemara takes this question further, because it wasn't just a case of the parents being punished. We said over here, the whole tribe, Bilgah, the whole group, second cousin, eighth cousin, great grandfathers 5 times removed. We're talking here about people who might have been in a very, very large distant family, many generations down, lots and lots of branches. You can't look at one branch and say that because of that father and that daughter, every other branch should be condemned to ridicule. So why are we doing it? That's the Gemara's question now. Just because okay, even if I were to accept this answer of Abaye, that the parents carry some sort of responsibility, but simply because of that, are we going to punish the whole mishmar? This whole group should suffer as a result of the malfeasance of one very small group. So now we come back to this famous statement again. Actually, the answer the Gemara is going to give now, some say it's got nothing to do with the question that we just said. How can you punish the whole group? But in simple terms, I think it does, in the simplest terms. Omer Abaye, again, Oile Rosha, Oile Shcheno. Woe is to a Rosha, woe is to his neighbor. Tov la tzaddik, the Tov la Shcheno. Good is to a tzaddik, and good also will come to his neighbor, even if his neighbor wasn't a tzaddik. In other words, you get influenced by your environment, and not only are you influenced by your environment, but somehow you get caught up with any penalties or any privileges of that environment. It's another aspect of it. It doesn't necessarily mean because you're next door to a Rosha that woe to you as a neighbor because he'll have an influence on you, but almost it means that essentially you will share a destiny with him. And the Gemara brings this example where this comes from originally with a house that is Mitzorah. You have a person, you know, in Parashas Mitzorah, it talks about houses also that could become, if you like, leprous with this sort of mold on them. There's a whole routine to decide what to do, take out the furniture, lock it up for 7 days, do all sorts of strange things. If nothing has changed after the necessary modicum time, you knock the house down. And then you have to rebuild it. That's the din of a house, a bias tzarua. Now, what happens if you live in a semi-detached house? That house wall is jointly owned by somebody else. When you knock that wall down, the joint wall, you're opening up and knocking up down the house of the man next door. Collateral punishment. What has the man next door got to do because this particular house is tzarua? And indeed, even if you say that the man's house was tzarua because he was, I don't know, and he was a bad person, he said lashon hara, whatever you want to say, the man next door didn't. So why should his wall come down as a jointly owned wall? The answer is oila rosh, oila shcheno. Woe is to a person who happens to be a neighbor of a bad person. And maybe you should find out when you move in, before you complete a contract on a house, you should find out who your neighbor is. Because if your neighbor is a Rosha, then you might just suffer collateral damage, which is none of your fault at all. So the answer over here, according to Abaye, is the whole of the Bilga tribe, if you like, the greater Bilga tribe, are neighbors. They're all neighbors. They probably come from the same town. You remember I showed you that these different Mishmaras were generally from one particular area. So they may have been physical neighbors. They were also neighbors in terms of service, neighbors in terms of mishpacha, that sort of neighbors as well. So yes, there will be people within Bilga who don't deserve this, but they will be caught up in the same way as we said also that when the catastrophe comes to the world, God forbid, when there is a flood or an earthquake or a fire, innocent people who are Holocaust, innocent people get caught up with those who, even if we know some were not innocent, this is what happens at the time of war or any great disaster. Over here, Bilga as a whole is caught up in the punishment of a very small number of people who deserve punishment. The Miriam, possibly, and her parents. Now, that's a simple explanation over here. And I'm going to try something a little bit unusual before we go home. I'll just see whether that was the rings over here. That was that. And that was the shulchan. Okay. Now, try and bear with me for a moment. I'm going to stop sharing. I've got to get through a lot of technology to do what I really want to do, which is to share a video with you. Isn't that exciting? Share screen. If it doesn't work, never know. Chabad.org. Now, 1 second, I have to be very careful. When I start this video, you may not hear any sound. That doesn't really matter, actually, because there are also subtitles. But I'm also going to try to use an extra button here, which will try and share the sound internally and digitally, if you like, rather than what seems to be coming into my room. So give me a moment.
But why punish the entire dynasty? The Talmud answers, because woe is to the wicked, and woe is to his neighbor. In that case, the Talmud continues, good is for the righteous, and good will be for his neighbor, for the power of goodness is infinitely greater. A classic piece of Talmud in a totally new light.
Wenn geht zu dem Sehen von Mesichte Succah, mir gefindt durch dem Sipur und der Meise von Miriam Bas Bilgo, in der Fahr ist Reis in der Gemorde der Limud, von Tevla Sadek, Tevla Schchein. Wie bald sie durch hier das Reis gekommen, darf sich hier kommen der Fahr Schar. Die Gemorre sagt, auf was sie gewähren Miriam Bas Bilga in Mira Dossa, Übergebiet in dem Rengel. Die Tokin größere ist die größere in viele. Was sie dann noch gewähren, ist Asles Abdiet. Chasni gehabt mit nicht genieden. Danach sagt die Gemorre, was sie getan ist, ja reingegangen und hat angenommen den Beis Amigdash. Und danach hat sie genommen, Topchal am Isbeach und hat gesagt, Lukus, Lukus, als Eichel Mamenem shall Israel, wenn mit lehem Beis Zeros. Was für ein Erlich hat das, da gab es Mira Dossa und da gab es Nisas Lesarge. Setzt man das, a viele Mira Dossa und a viele Nisas Lesarge. Und sie gegangen mit die, was haben eingenommen den Beis Amigdash. Herangetragen hin zu der Welt, die Inni von der Dalle, was wir dort machen. Ist einfach bekäme Mondmen von ihr, oder das so, was ist geklappt mit der Sandel auf dem Isbeach. Was ist da der Schwachste bedauert? Und da ist ein Dwar Chidush. Sagt im Posek in Spanien, כי רק אסכם יודעתי מכל גיא הורץ על כן אפקד עליכם es הבניכם. Und das, was man mond bei Jeden.
Okay, I'm going to stop sharing there. It does go on. But I wanted to introduce you to the Lubavitcher Rebbe, who took a profound lesson from this particular last piece of Gemara. He says something, he comes up, if you listen to it all, with a very counterintuitive way of reading this Gemara, in a sense which turns Miriam from a villain into somewhat of a heroine, and only Chabad can possibly do something like that. So I'm going to share my screen with a more of a written précis of the Rebbe's interpretation. Okay. So the Lubavitch Rebbe's approach to this story of Miriam bat Bilga. Why? What are we? Not so much why does the whole tribe get into trouble, but what really is the Torah or the Gemara trying to tell you about Miriam? What was her real in-depth personality? So he says, let me try and make this larger. Second, I'm going to get rid of what I'm saying over here, which is driving me mad. So he says, in order to understand Lubavitcher Rebbe's incredible approach, we must review a classic explanation of Rambam as to why Beis Din in certain circumstances is permitted to coerce a man to give his wife a get, despite the Torah's requirement that the man give a get only of his own accord and free will. Rambam writes that when a person is forced by Beis Din to give a get, it is considered as though he agrees to give it of his own accord, because it is a mitzvah for him to divorce his wife in such a case. And every Jew fundamentally desires to perform Hashem's mitzvot. His refusal to divorce in such a circumstance is merely his Yetzer Hara, his evil inclination's decision, and not his authentic decision. It's a very powerful idea here. Therefore, as soon as he says, Rotzeani, I do agree to divorce, even under coercion, the divorce is considered to be done with the husband's full consent. Rambam explains that the coercion merely suppresses the Yetzer Hara and allows the true self, which truly wishes to obey Hashem's command, to emerge. This is very much a Melitz Yosha view of a Jewish personality, that even when a Jew rebels, that's really a Yetzer Hara, which is, if you like, an outer skin rebelling. But within, he is still loyal. If you like, the spark of the Jew inside is there, even though it may well be completely obscured. The Lubavitcher Rebbe gives a deeply moving, inspiring explanation of the Miriam bat Bilga story. He argues that Miriam bat Bilga's actions are examples of how fundamentally every Jew is committed to Torah and the Jewish people. Hashem loves and cherishes every one of us, and our connection can never be severed. Look at Miriam, argues the Rebbe. You might think that she gave up everything, walked away from all that her people held dear, that she's now a Hellenist, married to an officer of the army, that defiles the Beis HaMikdash, and then severely insults the Mizbeach in a very public manner. A Jew cannot sink any lower. But when she reaches the sacrificial altar, something hits a raw nerve. She sees her fellow Jews suffering, and her deep pain is exposed. In this moment of bitterness, what does she cry out? Wolf, wolf, you consume the Jewish people's wealth, but you don't answer them in their time of need. In other words, Hashem, how are you letting this happen? Her pain and response stress just how very connected she really was to Hashem and the Jews. She acknowledges Hashem and his relationship with Jews and can't bear his silence. In other words, it was the pain that made her strike out like that. But somehow she was struck by the relationship of the Mizbeach to the Jewish people and emotionally drained when she saw what was happening to them, despite the Mizbeach. Miriam may have viewed herself as no longer Jewish, not interested in Hashem, intermarried with the enemy, Hellenized, a pagan, but in reality there was merely a superficial layer masking her true identity. The Jewish soul is bound to Hashem regardless of its outer spiritual appearance, even during the time of sin. At her core, she was a Jewish woman, and every moment presented the potential for her to return and reconnect with Hashem through the Torah and mitzvot. The Rebbe explains that Miriam Bat Bilga teaches a lesson of monumental importance. If even a Jew who has converted out of Judaism and married an enemy of our people fundamentally remains committed to Torah, then every Jew has the potential to be reached by a committed Jew who is deeply committed to Torah. The secret to our successful outreach to people like Miriam Bat Bilga can be discovered in the contrasting phrases of Oile Rosha, Oile Shcheno, and Tov L'Tzadik, Tov L'Shcheno. These phrases seem to contradict each other. One teaches that a Rasha will influence his neighbor for the worse, and the other teaches that a tzaddik will influence his neighbor for the good. The contradiction there is that supposing you have a Rasha next to a tzaddik. Which of these two phrases is right? Is it the Rasha who influences the tzaddik, or the tzaddik who will influence the Rasha? They can't both be true at the same time. So the Lubavitcher Rebbe resolves the contradiction by noting that everything depends on who is the neighbor, the tzaddik or the Rasha. If the tzaddik is inactive, then he is a neighbor. Then he will be negatively impacted by the Rasha. However, if the tzaddik takes control of the situation and actively seeks to influence his neighbors in a positive manner, then he will be successful in doing so. The reason the Gemara is so confident in Tzaddik's ability to influence the Rasha is that even the Rasha is fundamentally committed to Torah, as evidenced by Miriam Bat Bilga's behavior. A dedicated and committed tzaddik is able to peel off the superficial layers of the assimilated Jew and allow the Rasha's true self to emerge. Miriam Bat Bilga is traditionally viewed as a classic Talmudic villain to be vilified, repudiated and despised by every Jew. Lubavitcher Rebbe teaches us otherwise. Following the Berditchever Rebbe's classic examples of limud zchut, finding something positive in even the most estranged of Jews, the Lubavitcher Rebbe understands the Miriam Bat Bilga story to teach that every Jew can be redirected to a more positive Jewish life by a deeply committed Jew who is resolute in his devotion to uplift himself and his fellow Jews. So that's a remarkable explanation here, that Miriam Bas Bilga, she was struck and her conscience was essentially moved by the fact that the Jewish people suffering this large moment. And when she seemed to rebel and she says, HaKadosh Baruch Hu hasn't done anything for his people, she was essentially saying, why don't you do something for your people? Even though she was a Hellenist and a pagan and married to the Greek officer. But what I thought so beautiful about this is that so much expresses the identity of Chabad Hasidus, how they could possibly see this. This is the way they are, outgoing, active. If you're the active one, you influence. If you're the passive one, then you're influenced. Very interesting story. So anyway, I think we'll call an end to the recording.